Hello, my name's Andrew Hugill. I'm a bearded white male wearing glasses, age 66. Today I'm wearing a blue t-shirt. This talk is entitled Systems and Special Interests, the Formation of George W. Welch in the 1980s. This is a shortened version of a much longer article that's available on my website. Let's begin by just listening to a little clip of George W. Welch recorded on BBC Radio 3 sometime in the 1980s, playing my piece Catalogue de Grenouilles, Catalogue of Frogs. That's a turning point in the composition where you start to find it more and more difficult to distinguish between the human sounds and the frog sounds. In the late 1970s in the UK, battle lines between the avant-gardists and the experimentalists in contemporary music were clearly drawn. The factions frequently came into conflict at composer weekends organised by the SPNM, the Society for the Promotion of New Music. The Briars White Ensemble performance of Out of Zaleski's Gazebo, with its repetitious non-functional tonal systems and interjections of cheesy cadences from Percy Grainger, was disrupted by angry modernists who stood at the bar at the back of the York University Concert Hall, making as much noise as possible. The Nyman Band's performance at St John's Smith Square in London was followed by a very heated argument in the crypt below the church. It was impossible to argue during the performance or disrupt the performance because the sound was just too loud. Despite these altercations, the two camps did influence one another. Compositions began to appear on the avant-gardist side, which incorporated some experimentalist mannerisms or minimalistic processes. The experimental scene, on the other hand, was working hard to demonstrate its rigour and establish itself as an equally valid tradition to the grand narrative of modernism. From the point of view of a young music student, there was excitement in the feeling that somehow this all mattered. Even though the contemporary classical music world was a small one and already rather marginal, at least in terms of the classical music industry, which was itself a much smaller market than rock and pop, there was a strong feeling of personal identity and musical excitement invested in these developments. It was possible to ignore the wider lack of exposure and concentrate on being at what seemed like the cutting edge of innovation. Everybody knew that the likelihood of fame and commercial success was remote. But none of that was important in the short term. It was much more valuable to be part of something new, something radical that advanced the limits of musical understanding. Each composer and musician I encountered at that time wanted to make this kind of contribution. Their stance was as much political as it was artistic. This was the era of Margaret Thatcher and a seemingly interminable conservatism that demanded some kind of resistance, or at least critique. There was a shared sense of commitment to education as a force for good and not just as a training ground for employment. There was a kind of unifying idealism which was highly motivating and provided the energetic fuel on which these ensembles ran. The ensemble that was to become George W. Welch, I'll call it GWW from now onwards, first met in the autumn of 1981 in a flat in Shooters Hill Road, Blackheath, South London. The multi-instrumentalist and composer John Abraham came together with myself and my brother, the artist and designer Mark Thompson, to read through my composition entitled A.SC.H. Now, at that time, I was still using my shortened given name, Andrew Thompson. During the early 1980s, I started to include my middle name, Andrew Hugill Thompson, partly to distinguish myself from the unrelated musicologist Andrew Thompson. And you can see articles on the slide. The one on the left is by Andrew Thompson, and the one on the right is by myself, with my middle name included. Eventually, in 1989, I dropped Thompson altogether and changed my name legally to Andrew Hugill. John Abraham and I were music students at the University of Kiel, where we were both completing an MA in composition under the supervision of Roger Marsh. Mark Thompson, by contrast, was a fine art student at Chelsea School of Art, studying with Anthony Hill and others. The combination of music with visual arts thus became a characteristic of the ensemble from the outset, and one which was later to prove crucial in terms of its identity. The music that I was composing was, I now recognise, a product of my undiagnosed autism. I've titled this paper Systems and Special Interests because this is a phrase that will have immediate meaning to anybody familiar with theories of autism. Special interests are part of the diagnostic criteria, reflecting the tendency for autistic people to become intensely focused on restricted topics. While everybody has some tendency to systematisation, in autistic people this is tuned to high levels, according to Simon Baron-Cohen. In the 1970s, an autism diagnosis would never have been given to someone without learning difficulties. This is why so many people, like me, have been diagnosed late in life. For those interested in this topic, a forthcoming book on autism and music by Professor Pam Heaton of Goldsmiths College includes me and several other autistic musicians as case studies. A.SC.H was a good example of these systems and special interests. It was scored for piano, electric guitar and bongos, which Mark played on upturned ice cream cartons. It focused on Schumann's system of ciphers that had been explored by Eric Sams, and synesthesia, which I had experienced since childhood. I combined some hidden messages with fleeting moments in Scriabin's Prometheus, a Poem of Fire, when the colour organ's output matched my own synesthetic experience of the music. The composition extends and systematically repeats these fragments, separating out their rhythms from their harmonic and melodic content. In the autumn of 1982, I posted a notice in the music department at Goldsmiths College, inviting any interested musicians to join a group to play some recent experimental music. The notice was quite vaguely worded, and it was rather unclear exactly what this ensemble would do, mainly because I was not sure myself. It became evident quite quickly that this would not be an improvising group, but would play from music notation. This did lead, regrettably, to the early departure of some participants whose main interest was improvisation, but the majority preferred to read music. The resulting band formed into a kind of broken consort, comprising tuned and untuned percussion, string trio, a single clarinet or saxophone, and piano. It included two individuals who were to be stalwarts throughout its existence, the viola player Michael Newman and the tuba player James Hill. Early performances at Goldsmiths in 1983 included John Abraham's systematic composition Anything Can Happen in the Next Half Hour for 4 decay instruments and several sustaining instruments, and Gavin Bryce's Cross-Channel Ferry. Two other composer-musicians from the University of Kiel subsequently joined the ensemble, Sean Rourke, who became the band's manager, and Ian Gardner, whose compositions such as Small World and 21st Century Foxtrot cheerfully embraced aspects of popular dance, jazz and film music. One other composer-pianist who also joined early on was Jonathan Parry. John provided a link to another ensemble that was then forming, Regular Music, directed by Jeremy Peyton-Jones. This cross-fertilisation between ensembles became common over time, and many musicians who subsequently played in our ensemble also played in others. What was remarkable about our ensemble, and many others too, was that the participants gave their time and commitment for free. None of us had any money. I was living on benefits at the time, and others were surviving on small student grants. There was something extraordinary about the sense of mission of this ensemble that drove the passion and energy of the band members. After a couple of concerts at Goldsmiths, it became essential to distill this sense of commitment into a band identity. The band needed a name. Mark and I had both been somewhat obsessed with the work of Marcel Duchamp since our teens, finding him to be a doorway into many other things, such as the writings of Alfred Jarry and the music of Erik Satie. For myself, this interest crystallised my involvement with surrealist literature and other occult writings, mainly in French. As a visual artist, Mark's interest was primarily in Duchamp's imagery and the use of techniques such as collage. Mark proposed the name George W. Welch, taken from this rectified ready-made, wanted $2,000 reward of 1923, in which Duchamp had inserted photos of himself into a joke poster he found in a New York restaurant. Right from the start, Mark decided that there would be no fixed identity, that the imagery would travel from one iteration to another. As he said, talking to me in February this year, George W. Welch occupied a number of different forms, one of which was a 10-piece crazy music ensemble, and the others of which were things that appeared in graphic situations like this. This shifting identity is evident from early leaflets and concert programmes, as shown on this slide. The first dates from 1985 and shows GWW wearing a bow tie and an impact collar stiffener of the kind used in French laundries, as if getting dressed up to give a concert. The central figure in the background are photocopies of part of a collage by Hannah Hirsch, a Dadaist and political artist best known for her photomontages made during the years of the Weimar Republic. The text is handwritten in a compressed font. Note the use of photocopying, which was the only affordable art form available to us, but also which offered interesting creative possibilities. The second concert programme, made a year later, similarly combines some found material with original typography. This time made with Letraset. GWW is represented as a combination of Jacques-Louis David's classic painting Marat Assassiné with an ironing board, evoking the famous phrase of the Comte de Lautréamont, as beautiful as the chance encounter on an ironing board of a sewing machine and an umbrella. Here the ironing board becomes an irony board, a key idea given the multiple layers of irony in the GWW concept. In 1986, Mark began to make small collages depicting Ladislau Biro, who was best known as the inventor of the eponymous ballpoint pen, but was also a surrealist artist. Once again, the theme of collision between art and business is to the fore. Here, Biro's face is replaced by that of the Mona Lisa, with the eyes offset and whitened, changing gender in a nod to Duchamp's famous rectified ready-made à la chair au cou. The sideways glance echoes that of the animal head in the Hannah Hirsch collage, and the suit and tie also evokes the impact bow tie. Mark then transformed this into the well-known image of George W. Welch on the right. This was made as the cover of an A5 folder at the behest of Sean Rourke, as marketing material for the band. The Biro collage is here photographed and enlarged by a factor of 8, resulting in the little rosettes of printing ink on the face. Ian and I were then photographed as GWW with an attempt to mimic the initial image using lighting and the same kind of head tilt. My tie sports the gidouille or spiral emblem of the Collège de Pataphysique, which contrasts nicely with Ian's straight lines, which I see as an unconscious echo of the London Underground rail lines that were to become the titles of several of his works in this period. While the Mona Lisa image became the most associated with GWW, the imagery continued to evolve, and in 1991 Mark produced this flyer for our second Purcell Room concert. This took place around the time of the Gulf War, and so here Duchamp's profile is used as a kind of coastline, reminiscent of the pictures of Q8 that were dominating the news. Social and political comment were always a subtle part of GWW, albeit made through an ironic filter. The great thing about the name George W. Welch was that it provided a memorable identity for the band, while at the same time making no statement about the nature of the music that it would produce, nor even the fact that it was an ensemble. This playful ambiguity typified the whole stance of GWW, which always managed to combine multiple layers of ironical meaning behind its post-minimal surface. In this sense, it had more in common with conceptual art than much of the other music that was around at the time. In the early days, GWW was very much an experimental ensemble. For example, in 1983 and 84, we set about restringing 6 guitars by removing all the low E strings and placing them on one guitar, then all the A strings onto a second guitar, and so on, in the manner of Percy Granger's suggestion for the accompaniment to Chalet Brown. We named this instrument George W. Pickens. It became evident that the tension on the higher strings was too great for the guitars, and so they would not stay in tune long enough to complete a whole piece. As a result, GWP was short-lived, but you can hear one of these guitars playing during this brief excerpt from a performance of my composition A Slight List, which was given as part of our very first concert at the British Music Information Centre in 1984. After this beginning, there was an interruption. John Abraham emigrated to Canada, while I was employed as a musical assistant by Gavin Bryars, working on French productions of his opera Medea. When I returned, GWW started up again and steadily included new members. During this time, Ian Gardner became co-director, and the repertoire evolved to reflect the two directorial voices. This was a highly effective combination because Ian's compositions and brilliant arrangements of Satie, John White and others had an engaging and cinematic quality that contrasted well with my works, which Ian has described as ruminative and inscrutable mechanisms. Audiences grew to the extent that we were able to fill the Purcell Room in 1991. We also attracted a small amount of funding and were able to stage a George W. Welch festival at Lauderdale House, Highgate. Throughout the 1980s, we gave concerts at the ICA, Purcell Room, Blackheath Concert Halls and many other London venues. We recorded several times for BBC Radio 3, contributed to an Arts Council documentary on Gavin Bryars, and later performed my realisation of Satie's Usbud for a BBC 2 documentary on the composer. The changing line-up of the ensemble included musicians such as the violinist Karen Snelson, Kate Smith and Charles Mutter, the violist Karen Demmel, and the saxophonist Colin Payne. 4 musicians joined during the mid-1980s who were to continue as members right through to the end of GWW. Julia Munn played clarinet and saxophone, and contributed a key melodic voice to the ensemble. Her involvement with the Harmony Band, directed by Paul Robinson, provided another link with a different ensemble, this one specialising in music for theatre and silent film. The violinist Marina Solarek brought experience of playing with the BBC Radio Orchestra and many other ensembles, and so lent an authoritative leadership to the string section. The composer and percussionist Simon Allen contributed a delicate sensibility and an eclectic ear that expanded the resources of the percussion section in more ways than just instrumentation. The cellist Hugh McDowell, who sadly died in 2018, had a wealth of experience from his time as a member of the Electric Light Orchestra. His musical contribution was strong, but he also provided rehearsal facilities and a sense of professionalism that was infectious. The classic lineup of GWW at this time, then, settled down as shown on the slide. In 1986, I began working with Gavin Bryars and Dave Smith at Leicester Polytechnic as a full-time lecturer. Over the next couple of years, it became increasingly difficult for me to reconcile my academic commitments with the business of running a music ensemble in London. Eventually, I decided to relinquish my role as director and hand over to Ian. He went on to achieve marvellous things with the group, performing soundtracks to many silent films, as well as his own concert works. In 1993, his piece for radio entitled Monument was broadcast on BBC Radio 3 and won a special prize at the 1994 Prix Italia and a 1994 Sony Radio Award. GWW and similar ensembles surfed on the second wave of cybernetics, which broke in the 1970s. Its exploration of the reflexivity of involving an observer as part of a system had a humanising effect, which meant that many of the ensembles were identified with individuals whose creative trajectories and musical personalities were identifiably expressed by the systems they chose to use. To paraphrase Jack Burnham, in a systems-oriented culture, change emanates not from things, but from the way things are done. By applying systematised transformations to familiar or found materials, GWW and ensembles like it could make a social comment while eschewing the appearance of authoritative finality that characterised modernist music. For me, personally, my various obsessions with occult and alchemical literature, with composers such as Scriabin and Messiaen, who, like myself, was synesthetic, and with figures such as Satie and Jarry, who appeared to be autistic, although I would not have recognised that term at the time, resulted in a series of compositions whose meanings are located both in the conceptual domain and in the reality of lived experience. Time does not permit a detailed discussion of the musical characteristics of these works, but I have included some detailed descriptions in the long version of this paper on my website. This chart shows a complete set of GWW pieces I composed and indicates the special interests, systems and found materials used in each one. The found materials, I should stress, were short fragments rather than extended quotations, which I would then use either to punctuate the music or by applying processes to generate longer material. Looking back, the thing that strikes me most about GWW, and indeed about all the other ensembles that were active in the 1980s, is the immense sense of energy and enthusiasm that carried them along. People were so generous in contributing their time and experience to the performance of untried works whose existence relied a lot on the musician's belief in the likelihood of their inherent worth. There was an element of competition between the ensembles, which were really vying for attention. However, there was also a great deal of collaboration and cross-fertilisation between them. I remember enjoying all the outputs of the various bands around at the time and developing connections with many of their members. This was a culture that formed a self-supporting and convivial network based around acoustic music. Most young composers were emerging from music departments in universities and polytechnics, and so were trained in the production of instrumental rather than electronic music. At that time, it was quite unusual to study composition, and music technology was a little-used phrase that referred mainly to recording studio engineering. There are almost no degree courses available in that subject, whereas many academic institutions offered music. Of course, that situation has now reversed, and we're seeing a great decline of music as a subject of study, and a relative flourishing of creative music technology courses that see every student as a potential composer, performer and engineer combined. The new digital culture this has produced has much in common with and much to learn from the ensemble culture of the 1980s. Let's end with a brief clip from Eastward O, here featuring the solo clarinet of Julia Munn.